Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica. I make videos on career, education, and lifestyle. Today's video is all about life in industry versus consulting and really the difference between both, so you might try to figure out what your next best career move might be. If you're new here, I would really appreciate if you subscribed. I am really excited to have you here. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. All right, the first difference that I want to highlight is type of knowledge. So currently I work in the consulting space, but before my current role, I worked in industry and I worked for a firm in the internet industry. And so my specific role was really involving the sales part of the organization. I was essentially a data analyst, and I used the data that was available to understand how our salespeople were performing and really how to get our revenue up. So over the course of the time that I worked at this company, I developed a lot of deep expertise on, for instance, how hiring salespeople might work, how does retention work, what is the turnover like, what are our revenue numbers over different months, how are different salespeople performing. And so typically when you work in industry, you develop a lot of knowledge within your specific role that you essentially become a mini expert, right? That's kind of in direct contrast to life in consulting. I essentially have to learn the offerings of the current organization and try to become an expert on the different offerings that we give to clients, and that really involves developing your skill set. But I have worked with clients in so many different industries. I'm not necessarily specific to one industry anymore, and therefore your breadth of knowledge is really wide because you've touched so many different types of clients that are navigating different challenges within their specific industry. So then it becomes your prerogative to really understand the space that each of your clients operate in. And so your skill set and your depth of knowledge isn't necessarily in one industry, it just becomes a lot more widely spread. And in a sense, you develop a much deeper understanding of what's happening in the entire market as opposed to the functional area that you work in. The second difference that I want to highlight is work-life balance. Now, when I worked in the industry, I had a pretty predictable lifestyle. I typically logged on at 9, I logged off at 5, and I really knew what I could get in a typical work week. There really wasn't a lot of really predicting what I had to do, right? I knew what my work schedule was, and that's about it. And also, you work for the direct client, right? So there's really no logging your hours and time. It's just, that's your work schedule, you work your 40 hours typically. There's not necessarily a pressure to stay longer, work harder. There's really no pressure typically to travel. And so overall, you have a better work-life balance and structure than what you might find in consulting. In contrast, in consulting, it really depends on the type of firm that you work for, but work tends to be more cyclical from what I've observed. So sometimes you have a few busy seasons where it's all hands on deck and you're working crazy hours, but other times it might be slower. And so it really depends on the type of season that you are that determines your work schedule. And also, I'm not a traveling consultant, but I do know that a lot of firms do travel to their client site. And I think also things have really changed because of COVID, and clients are starting to recognize that consultants don't have to be in their space working, you know, the whole day for them to see that there's work being done. And so there's been a lot of shift that's happened in the industry right now, and clients recognizing that. But regardless, typically some sort of travel is expected, and your work you could be working a few more hours than you might be working in the industry. And I've definitely seen a lot of people get burnt out being in consulting. So that's definitely something to be mindful of if your priority is having a really good work-life balance. Really think about, you know, what could really help you fit that lifestyle. I also know some firms that offer really great work-life balance even when you're a consultant. So you really have to find what works for you and the type of culture that that firm is willing to provide. Okay, so the third difference I would like to highlight is in relationships. Now, typically when you work in industry, you work with your manager, or you might work with a few people in your unit, and you typically develop very deep relationships with the people that you work directly with because you're working with them day in and day out, and that's really what your work involves, is developing those deep relationships with the people that you're around. And that's pretty much in contrast with consulting, where you will have a manager, but you might not be working directly with your manager. The types of people that you're working with is constantly shifting. So for instance, if you have a few clients at a time, or if you know you have one client after another client, the types of people that you work with really tends to change and shift. Even internally, right? The types of people that may be staffed on every project that you're in is different. So there's really no one set of people that you form really deep relationships with. You typically get to know the people that you're working with directly and foster a relationship, and then you might stay in touch with them after, but you're no longer really working with them in a very deep way, in the same way that you might be if you work in the industry. So it's different in terms of the types of relationships that you can have with people and what you really thrive on. All right, the fourth difference that I want to highlight is execution. So what I mean is that in industry, say, you come up with an idea. You might take it to your manager and say, hey, I have this really cool idea. I've seen a need, and this is, what my solution could be. So if they say, oh, interesting, you might go talk to different people. You might really try to narrow down what that solution could be like. And then, you might say, oh, this is what I'm coming up with. And your manager might say, okay, cool, go build it. And so you might spend a few weeks really building the tool. And then you might get to test the tool with different users and then really publish it and get to see what people liked and disliked, and then maybe you iterate on it, and then you make it better, so on and so forth. So you might really own a process from beginning to end, and that's very different than consulting. And what I mean is that as a consultant, you might try to solve a specific problem, and you might give a client some solutions on how to solve a problem in whatever space that you might consult in. But once you sort of hand that over, typically there's no resolution that comes, right? The client takes your idea, takes your suggestions, and they might implement it and figure out what works for their organization. But you might not necessarily get to see the direct impact of your work and how your solution fits into the client's work and their industry and just what happens after. You don't really get to see that. And so it's quite different. You never really get to close the circle. You never really get to get that feeling of like, this is what happened, and people liked it or didn't like it, it worked or it didn't. There's, you really don't get to see what happens after you hand it off to the client, because now you're on to the next client trying to help them figure out a solution for their problem, right? So you might work with a lot of different clients, but you don't necessarily get to see what happens at the end. The fifth difference that I want to highlight, and it's highly subjective, is career growth. In industry, I've seen that there isn't always a very well laid out promotion plan and career growth plan. So it might really be up to you on charting your own course when you try to figure out what moving up looks like in an organization. But that's been really different from my experience in consulting, because there's been a very well laid out promotion plan and career plan, and it's really clear on what you have to do to move from one level to the next level, and you can really chart out where you might be after working this many years at an organization if you succeed, right? So everything is pretty clear. So another thing that I want to say with career growth is that consulting experience tends to definitely be very highly valued. And that's because you get to work on so many different types of problems in such a short amount of time, that I've really seen that different employers do tend to value different consulting experience, just because it's sort of a career fast track, right? You get to be exposed to a lot of problems all at once and you have to solve them all. And so I've seen that consulting experience is definitely very valued when it comes to industry. Thank you so much for watching up to this point. I currently work in consulting and I really value the career opportunities that it's provided me so far. I've really enjoyed the types of problems that I've got to work on and the different types of clients that I've got to interact with. And I've really noticed that my learning has really accelerated so far during my time in consulting. Well, I'm really happy and I definitely could see myself working in consulting a few more years. So I'm excited to continue to grow. And overall, I want to say thank you so much for watching the video. I would really appreciate it if you subscribed and stayed for the journey. I will continue to make more videos like this and I'll catch you on my next one. Bye.